Hi YouTube, my name is Michael Berenger. I'm a medical doctor and a full professor of sports medicine and exercise physiology at Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. Have you ever wondered what's really going on within your muscles when you contract against a certain amount of resistance and your force starts to drop? Or you hit the point of muscle failure so you can do, for example, 8 repetitions, but number 9 just won't move? What causes that drop in force over time? So why do we fatigue? This phenomenon, muscle fatigue, is actually older than mankind. Since it's quite complex, that might be the reason why there are so many myths floating around about what is actually the cause of muscle fatigue. So today we're going to do some myth busting on the one side, and more importantly, we will have a deeper look into what science knows so far about the molecular and cellular mechanisms behind muscle fatigue. So let's dive into it. I frequently ask my students what they think causes muscles to fatigue, and about half of them say it's because muscles run out of energy, and the other half usually blames lactic acid. But here's the thing, the first explanation, so that running out of energy is the cause, is very likely wrong, and the other one, lactic acid, is at least overrated. So let's have a closer look. When we say running out of energy, that would actually mean that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, would reach a critical concentration within the muscle cell. And yes, ATP is absolutely essential for muscle contraction. It powers the cross-bridge cycle, which is the actual movement within the cell between actin and myosin, two very important proteins. And furthermore, ATP fuels ion pumps so that they maintain the cell's internal environment, which is also very important for muscle contraction. So if ATP is that important, it seems reasonable to assume that fatigue means we're just running out of it. But that's not the case. Studies have shown that even during intense workouts, your ATP concentrations do not drop below 60% of your resting concentrations. And that is because your muscle cells are incredibly protective about their ATP levels. Why? Because very low ATP concentrations could lead to a cellular damage or even cell death. So the system is designed to avoid that at any cost. And think about it. If you perform a 1 repetition maximum, a single maximal lift, it's highly unlikely that your muscle ran out of energy just after 1 repetition. So this would avoid any other repetition here. That would make no sense. So now, fatigue is not simply due to an empty energy tank. The story is much more complex. And if we say that this explanation is very likely wrong, there was the second explanation, lactic acid, and I said this is overrated, so let's break this down. First of all, when people talk about lactic acid, they're often mixing up terms. So what actually accumulates during intense exercise is lactate, so the conjugate base of lactic acid, along with hydrogen ions. These are byproducts of the anaerobic glycolysis or the hydrolysis of ATP. And the hydrogen ions lower the pH inside the muscle cell. And it's this acidification, not lactate itself, that was historically blamed for muscle fatigue. And yes, during heavy exercise, intracellular lactate levels can rise to over 30 millimolar and pH can drop by about 0.5 units. And since pH is the negative decadic logarithm, that's quite a substantial shift. But it's important to separate their effects. So lactate and hydrogen ions. Let's start with lactate. According to Allen and colleagues, Allen did a great review with his colleagues on muscle fatigue. I will place the link in the description. And according to Allen and colleagues, lactate itself does not directly cause fatigue. First of all, lactate levels were found not to correlate very well with muscle fatigue in humans. And furthermore, experiments with skin muscle fibers have shown that even lactate concentrations of 50 millimolar have relatively little effect on muscle fatigue. On the contrary, it may even help buffer acidity and even support metabolism under stress and thereby counteracting fatigue to a certain degree. What about hydrogen ions? The hydrogen ions, on the other hand, can definitely affect certain processes like binding of calcium to troponin or the activity of myosin ATPase. But here's the catch: at physiological temperatures, these effects are much less severe than once thought. So muscles can still generate significant force despite moderate acidification. So while a drop in pH may contribute slightly to fatigue, it's not the main cause. And blaming lactic acid is both scientifically inaccurate and it is outdated. Fatigue is far more complex, and that brings us to the real players. But before we look at what disrupts muscle function, we need to clarify one important thing, and that is that calcium is the central switch for muscle contraction. So every time your muscle contracts, your brain sends a signal down the spinal cord where it is relayed onto the alpha motor neuron, which then carries the impulse to the muscle, and this triggers the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This calcium then binds to troponin C, which shifts tropomyosin of actin's binding site, allowing myosin to bind and generate force. So calcium is the central molecular signal that triggers contraction. Without calcium, there's no force. But calcium's role in force production depends on 4 critical processes. First of all, it's the release itself. So calcium needs to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, abbreviated SR. And the next thing is the sensitivity of the contractile machinery to calcium. Then the maximum force at a saturating calcium concentration, what researchers call the maximum calcium activated force, and finally the reuptake of calcium back into the SR. All 4 of these can be affected during fatigue, but not all of them have the same functional impact. The first 3, so the decrease in release, the sensitivity of the system, and the maximal activated force by calcium will directly reduce force output. By contrary, the reuptake just slows down relaxation and recovery between contractions, but has less direct effects on force during a single effort. So in fatigue, what we are often seeing is that less calcium is released, a system that is less responsive to it, and even when calcium is there, the machinery itself does not produce the same amount of force. Now that we understand how calcium controls force production, the next question is what actually disrupts this system during fatigue. So there are 2 factors that stand out in the literature, and most importantly, it's inorganic phosphate and reactive oxygen species. Let's have a look at how each of them affect calcium release, sensitivity, maximal calcium activated force, and the reuptake. During repeated contractions, of course, ATP needs to be broken down so it releases its energy, and what increases are the phosphate levels inside the muscle cells. And those can increase dramatically from 5 millimolar at rest to 30 millimolar. And this has multiple effects. The calcium release on the one side. Phosphate has been shown to enter the sarcoplasmic reticulum and combine with the free calcium there. So they form calcium phosphate, and this precipitates reducing the pool of releasable calcium. So the calcium release is affected. The calcium sensitivity is affected. So high phosphate slightly shifts the force calcium curve to the right, meaning that the same calcium concentration now produces less force. And furthermore, if calcium is not a limiting factor, so if there is a calcium saturation, phosphate has a direct inhibitory effect on cross-bridge cycling. So it has been shown that in single molecule studies that elevated phosphate prevents myosin heads from entering force-generating states and thereby reducing the maximum force at any calcium level. And last but not least, it's the calcium reuptake. So inorganic phosphate seems to impair the SERCA function, so the pumps that bring calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and this has a little effect on the relaxation time. Taken together, inorganic phosphate interferes with nearly every calcium-dependent step of contraction, making it a major contributor to peripheral fatigue. So if you want to blame muscle fatigue to a single molecule, choose inorganic phosphate and not lactic acid. And the second big factor is oxidative stress. So during sustained or high-intensity activity, mitochondria and other cellular processes generate those reactive oxygen species that are abbreviated as ROS. ROS don't just cause damage to certain parts, they target specific proteins involved in the calcium control. On the one side, calcium release. So ROS can oxidize the ryanodine receptor RYR1, destabilizing its function and thereby reducing calcium release from the SR. Next, calcium sensitivity. Oxidative modification of troponin C by the ROS reduces its ability to respond to calcium, shifting the forced calcium curve downward. And calcium, the maximum calcium activated force seems also to be affected by ROS, and ROS can directly impair the contractile proteins like myosin and actin, reducing their capacity to generate force, even at high calcium concentrations. And also, ROS seem to affect calcium reuptake, so SERCA pumps are also sensitive to oxidation, which can slow calcium clearance and impair relaxation. Furthermore, studies have shown that applying antioxidants like N-acetylcysteine can delay fatigue in both animal and human muscles, supporting the idea that ROS play a functionally relevant role in muscle fatigue. So, summary. Inorganic phosphate and ROS are the two main players that disrupt the calcium system during fatigue. It's the amount of calcium release, it's the responsiveness of the system to calcium, and the maximum force of the system that the system can produce when calcium is not a limiting factor. And while slower reuptake plays a role in recovery and pacing, it's those first three that explain the force decline we feel when muscles are fatigued. I hope you now understand a little bit more about muscle fatigue, and you now know that it's not lactic acid and it's not a low energy that is left in the tank that results in muscle fatigue. I hope you like this short episode. Leave a comment or a like. See you soon. Bye-bye.